Okay, so this is how thyroxine is used and how it's maintained within the body. So it's a confusing topic, and it didn't help that I'm pretty sure that's a mistake. That word should say thyroxine. What I find helps with understanding this topic is to make a note of what each word is. So you're going to read a bunch of stuff, and then you're going to go, what? And you're going to keep reading it and going, I still don't understand what that just says. So to break it down by looking, I try to identify what the words are that are tripping us up. So we've kind of like split that out there. So what is TSH? You talked about TSH. TSH is the thyroid stimulating hormone. It's released by the pituitary gland, which is, I think it's in your brain. Yeah, that'll be in your brain. Yeah. And and then if we keep reading, what does TSH do? It says, it doesn't say it very clearly until you read this part here. It says earlier on that it's responsible for maintaining normal levels of, and it just says normal levels, but normal levels of thyroxine. So TSH maintains normal level of thyroxine. Now, does that mean it stops thyroxine from being produced, or does it mean that it increases the amount of thyroxine being produced, or does it do both? A little bit more reading when we see that if the thyroxine is too high, then the release of TSH is inhibited. And so less, and this should say thyroxine, is released from the thyroid gland. So in other words, what this sentence, this bullet point is telling us is that TSH is going to cause the release of thyroxine because inhibiting the TSH reduces the amount of thyroxine being released. And if the levels of thyroxine are too low, so it's below normal level, then it causes the release of TSH from the pituitary gland, and so more thyroxine is released. So that's what TSH does, talking about the release of thyroxine. But then that should prompt us to ask, well, what is this thyroxine? Do I need to know what that does? Well, it says up here the thyroxine has two important roles. It stimulates the basal metabolic rate, and it stimulates the protein synthesis. So then that should prompt the next question of what are these two things? Well, protein synthesis is a little bit easier to understand. Synthesis just means the production of proteins in this case. So I think that one's reasonably self-explanatory, but BMR is not necessarily, so we need to self-explanatory. So reading it, it's the speed at which the chemical reactions occur in the body. So thyroxine will cause the proteins to be, indirectly will cause proteins to be produced, and it'll also control the speed of chemical reactions in the body. And the amount of thyroxine released will be caused by the TSH. Okay, so if there's lots of TSH, or if there's more TSH, more thyroxine will be released, which then in turn causes these two things to happen. So that's basically what it does, and then we just need to know this little bit of terminology using hyper and hypo. So hyper, too much of something; hypo, too little of something. And in this case, hyperthyroidism is when the thyroid gland is secreting, producing, giving out too much thyroxine into the bloodstream. And what would that do? Well, actually, fairly predictably, it increases the BMR and the protein synthesis. Well, of course it does, because it said earlier on that that's what thyroxine would do. And so if we had too much of it, it's going to increase that. It doesn't say here, as we can see, it doesn't say what would be such a bad thing about that. If my metabolic rate was too high or my protein synthesis was too high, what would be the downside to that? It doesn't say. So maybe, I'm not sure if that would be needed for your GCSE, but we could look into that as well if we need to. Hypothyroidism, too little thyroxine in the blood. And this does say it can lead to heart and nerve problems and death. Now, this heart and nerve problems is probably going to be something you'll want to remember, because it's a classic kind of exam question. What is hypothyroidism, and what issues could it lead to? And so this is very classic GCSE biology, where they'll ask you to actually say, identify these points here. And that you realise that hypo means too little of something. Hyper and hypo come up in hypothermia, hypothermia, hyperglycemia, hypoglycemia, and a couple of other ones I can't think of right now. So yeah, that's basically it for thyroxine.